Okay, Article 3, whether God exists. So here we have one of the most famous and wonderful articles in the Summa, the 5 ways of proofs, demonstrations for God's existence. Let's look at the objections. It seems that God does not exist, basically because if you have an infinite being, there can't have anything else. Okay, so I'll just hint at here. I mean, of course, if God is within the universe, if God was God, what we know about God, and He was in the universe, strictly speaking, just nothing else would be. You can't contain an uncreated being in a created universe. Okay, the incarnation, of course, does that, but that's a mystery. If God existed, there'd be no contrary. St. Thomas says there'd be no evil in the world. Because that's the contrary of goodness, and God is goodness. But there is evil in the world, so therefore. But I would, amplify this and say there wouldn't be anything other than God. If there's one infinite thing, an infinite spoon or infinite orange color or something, nothing else could exist. In a finite, world. So, but his argument is more modest to just say there wouldn't be evil if God existed, because God is infinite goodness, and therefore the contrary of goodness couldn't exist. Of course, this is a powerful argument against God's existence, the problem of evil, and I would say it's the most powerful argument of them all to give someone pause about believing in God's existence. Dostoevsky is the master literary exponent of this argument, who makes it very powerful in the mouth of Ivan Karamazov. Objection 2, we don't need God. Now, this sounds like modern science, right? We have everything we need. We don't want to bring in the God and the gaps. We don't want to, bring God in to explain things we can't explain by science. If we can't explain something by scientific principles, using Occam's razor, a few small principles, the fewest possible, theory of everything, then it's because we just haven't discovered it yet. If we brought in God, it would be lazy and it would be intellectually corruption, a sign of intellectual corruption, because we're bringing in a kind of explanation that doesn't explain anything because we don't know something. And this is what the ancients did with their, anthropomorphic explanations for lightning and thunder and things like that. I mean, that's sort of scientific scientism argument. And St. Thomas says we can account for everything by nature, everything in the natural by nature, right? And we can account for everything in the human world, things that have to do with voluntary actions, by human reason and will. In other words, humanism and naturalistic materialism and atheism explain everything we need to explain in the world. Okay, very amazing that these arguments were articulated 800 years ago and they're still around today. It's okay. So St. Thomas goes through the 5 ways. Now, there are literally books written on these 5 ways and innumerable scholarly articles going into all the details. I just want to comment briefly on them. Okay. And if you'd like to investigate and research this further, just go on any database and internet and research the debate and dialogues on this. It's interesting, even Thomists, or people who claim to be Thomists, at least Aristotelians, don't always accept these arguments. I mentioned Kant, but somebody with the stature and devotion to Aristotle, as Mortimer Adler, wrote a book called How to Think About God, where he completely rejects the demonstrability of God's existence in these 5 ways. It just can't be done, he says. And he actually gives a version of objection 2. He says there's no reason why the principles that we know in this world to explain things aren't sufficient. He just says that and gives arguments for it. Okay, so beginning with the very self-evident and indubitable experience we all have of motion, we can get to God. And there's some sort of metaphysical principles involved here, such that every effect has a cause, and there can't be an infinite regress. St. Thomas gives a pretty laconic explanation for why there can't be an infinite regress. There are people who have disputed this and said there can be an infinite regress. I also want to say that St. Thomas is not saying that this proof of motion shows that there is a first mover in time, like before the other movers. It's first in ontological priority, in causal priority. St. Thomas says in another place in his disputed question on the eternity of the world that God could have created an infinite series of moved movers. So just imagine a never-ending, never beginning, and never-ending system of intermediate causes. One thing causing another, one thing causing another, one thing moving another, another thing moving another. Now, there still has to be a first mover, but it's not first in time. It's first in a sense of being outside of that system and being the reason why the system of infinite causers, movers, exists in the first place. That's pretty much impossible for us to imagine this. But St. Thomas says that philosophy itself can't adjudicate between and can't know that there wouldn't be such a thing. I mean, God could have made that. The only reason we know there's a beginning in time and God's the first mover in time is through faith. Now, creation from nothing also is something that faith teaches us, but I think St. Thomas thinks that that can also be known by reason. But creation from nothing doesn't mean a beginning in time that God was before that. It still is. It's not, when God creates from nothing, He's not changing anything. It's a whole new mode of causation. It's pretty complicated. He's not causing the way we understand causing, because we can't understand what it would mean to bring something's existence into being, not merely changing it. Substantial change or accidental change. Okay. So there cannot be an infinite series of movers for St. Thomas. The other principle is that something cannot bring itself into actuality from potency. So with those two principles, that act is prior to potency, that the only reason there's something in act is because something else put it in act, because everything has potency. Everything created, that is. God is the only being without it. Even angels have it. And something cannot bring itself into actuality if it's in potency. Something else has to. Something cannot, so he says, nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. If you put those two together, no infinite regress and no potency unless prior actuality, and it leads you to the belief, to the conviction, that there has to be something in act that wasn't itself put into act, something in that can move another, but not because it was moved by another. In other words, its ability to move, it has in itself. And that being is pure act. Okay? And pure act is God. Okay, that's how St. Thomas is understanding this. Why can't there be an infinite regress? Because if there was no first mover, there'd be no intermediate. There can't be a bunch of hammers hammering nails unless there's some hand at some point moving the hammer. It doesn't make sense to have a tool without without something that's being used for and by. Okay? The definition of an intermediate cause is that which is not first, and that which needs something first to even exist. So it's kind of a self-contradiction to talk about an infinity of movers. Okay? He says subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it's put in motion by the hand or the hammer. Okay. All right, we'll go through the other arguments in the next comment.